Thank you very much, David. Yeah, it's a wear and tear of working at the Hong Kong Jockey Club, I think. So the pressure's really on now. Was it worth hanging on for this last talk? So I'm going to talk about fractures and try and summarize some of the changes and some of the important issues associated with trying to prevent fractures. It's not an entirely, although I've got a slightly personal picture here, it's simply to date it back to the mid-80s. And really, we didn't know an awful lot about fractures in racing around the mid-80s. There's a rather graphic picture. Some of you may spot this very unfortunate horse that's about to land in this picture here. And the picture of the rabbit is simply to make the point, around that time, we all thought that it was just an unfortunate event, that horses broke their legs on the racecourse every so often. The director of the course had let a rabbit on, it dug a hole somewhere, and the horse had put its foot down a rabbit hole, or something like that had happened. We have come a very, very long way since then in understanding why these fractures, which very often appear spontaneous in nature. The horse is galloping along and suddenly, bang, its leg is swinging around in the breeze. Why is that happening? And it's not because they put their foot down a rabbit hole. So I'm going to just very, very briefly take us and not go actually through any of the science. Anyone's interested, I can very happy to talk to you afterwards. But in the mid to late 80s, one of the most critical advances in our understanding of this was that we recognized the fatigue basis for racing fractures. So put it very simply, just if you take a paper clip and you bend it enough times, it'll then start to get little cracks in it, and the next time it will break. Exactly the same thing is going on with fractures. Here you can see the little break that's starting there, and then that wasn't noticed, and also went on and raced and got the more catastrophic injury. From that, we then went on to be able to start to characterize some of the pathological changes that are going on, which are essentially those little cracks in the paper clip. What do they look like in the bone? Where do they occur? That then allowed us to start to come up with some actual practical outcomes. We knew where to look with initially just X-ray. We could look for little cracks. We developed new X-ray projections which weren't used previously, which allowed us to see these fine little cracks and recognize them before the big fracture occurred. Then, around this time as well, there was a lot of epidemiological studies going on, trying to see what factors about a horse, or about the race, or about other wider issues might predispose a horse to fracture. And a lot of stuff came in from that. We started recognizing things like the going, the number of horses in a race, all these sort of things were associated with increased risk of fractures. Very complex field, many variations. But all this that was coming together, always the optimist to write a paper back in the late 1990s, really, or early 2000s, can we prevent fractures from actually happening in racehorses? We're starting to recognize enough. If we've got these little cracks that then lead to big fracture, well, surely we can recognize when the cracks are there, and then we can stop the fracture happening. So we really ought to be able to prevent this, and I was excited about that. And since then, there's been a burgeoning field of science looking at different aspects of preventing fractures from occurring. So let's working through it, identifying genotypes associated with risk of fractures. And now we recognize that there are certain genes that are associated with an increase of fracture. So it is possible to do a polygenic risk score or assign a polygenic risk score to a horse. If it has these particular genes, it will be at increased risk of getting a fracture, because it doesn't mean it's going to get a fracture, it just means it's slightly higher risk. Advanced diagnostic imaging, in particular, these imaging modalities that can be used in a standing horse, CT, MRI, PET, applications of omics, so look at lots of molecules in the blood, wearable devices to pick up changes in the horse's stride, and now monitoring the quantity of actual training load a horse is undertaking. And all these things have led to outcomes or implementations of initiatives that could be made to try and improve outcomes. So, with all this great stuff, Are we seeing a reduction in the number of fractures that are happening? Sadly, we're not. It's stuck at roughly 1 horse per 2,000 starters, around that, and it hasn't come down. If you look at a large number of jurisdictions, there's been very little change in that, apart from, as Liz has shown us, in the USA. But you will notice they started from a much higher base. So frankly, the change has happened there has been picking the low-hanging fruit and bringing it in line with the rest of the world. And I don't think I really called you a pariah in America, but I did point out there were some things that were different to many other jurisdictions, which I think ICE have been amazing at addressing. So the baseline has remained level despite all this amazing work and the increase in knowledge we've got. Why? Why is that happening? And I think there are probably two main factors. One, it is a very complex, multifactorial issue. Genetics going, exercise history of the horse. There are an awful lot of things that come together that impact it. And I just want to illustrate just a very, very simple search, and I purposely kept this simple. Horse and fracture, looking in PubMed, where we get access to a big database of all science published in the field, 2080 publications, really since the word go, since it was being recorded. For that, if you look at human and fracture, it's 100-fold bigger. Have medics been able to resolve fractures in humans, even in athletes? No. And yet, billions more will have been invested in it. This is a multifactorial, complex problem. But could we be doing better? And I'm still really optimistic, and I'm still really convinced that yes, we could. And it really, comes down to two issues. One, the fact that perhaps it is multifactorial, and two, the fact that this very simple little thing, and probably used fairly advisedly, called man. And what do I mean by that? Well, very simply, there are a lot of vested interests in all this and a lot of complexities. Scientists are not very good, often, at getting their message across. Who are the people who can translate that message and actually do huge amounts of hard work to get it into something that is adopted and done? There are a lot of vested interests. Polygenic risk scoring. I can imagine readers here sitting there feeling rather uncomfortable. I know the people who do this work come under great pressure and abuse from trainers, the fact they're doing this work. There's early warning of horses' increased risk of fracture. Well, amazing work gone on at Melbourne, really for one race. And the pressure on that is because of the existential crisis that race really, really faced, i.e., the pre-race screening using standing CT and withdrawing horses because of the results from that. Has that been received with universal goodwill? No, of course not. Are there lots of critics of it? Yes, because people who really want their horse and think it's going to win aren't allowed to run it in the race, and of course they're very upset. And there are all these things which have all sorts of complicated human factors which get in the way of their distillation and implementation. So I believe that's an important factor. Just looking at this, again, this is another huge wrap for HISA. Look at this. It's amazing. This data comes from Tim Parkin, who's done a lot of the epidemiological work in the States. And you can see, look at the difference between tracks in the USA, the fatality rates in tracks in the USA that have adopted HISA's rules and those that haven't. There's an outstanding promotion for HISA, and yet we all hear in the press those who would have HISA eliminated tomorrow if they possibly could, for whatever reasons. So it makes a point about the real focus of welfare. We've really got to look at it and question it very carefully. So how do we unite all the stakeholders and work towards a common purpose for welfare? How can racing collectively do that? The IFHA has made a big start towards that with a meeting we had in Toronto in 2024 where we got groups working fractures and exercise-associated sudden death together, and then again a meeting we had in Hong Kong primarily run by the Hong Kong Jockey Equine Welfare Research Foundation, has certainly helped to draw that together. But we need, I believe, if you really, really want to get these figures down further, it needs an industry-wide collaboration. And as Winfried would say, we need to address the fragmentation of a lot of what's going on here. Just one last point I wanted to make, and this is that we're focusing today and a lot of the time about fractures and exercise-associated sudden death, and just a plea to keep horse welfare and social license in their respective places. So let's just look, for example, at the problems of fractures versus degenerative disease of the fetlock joint of horses, which is a big problem. It affects a lot of horses on their race when they retire simply through disease accumulated during racing. If we look at social license, fractures have a critical impact. They're the thing that society sees and judges racing on, but they affect very few horses. Whereas orthopedic disease of the fetlock joint does affect quite a few horses, but it has minimal impact on the actual perception from the public because people have seen that. If we look at welfare, it has a very important impact on horses. A large number of horses will have a pretty miserable time because of chronic disease of their joints as a consequence of repetitive training, etc. So from a welfare perspective, the two things, social license and welfare, are not always aligned. So as I said, it's a plea for us to be aware of that and be aware that a lot of the things associated with training and routine racing actually have much more impact on welfare than those things that have a great impact on social license. Thank you very much.